Abandoned by his own children and left to face the harsh Appalachian winter, veteran Samuel Peterson had lost all hope. But his most loyal companion, an aging German shepherd named Ghost, began to act strangely. The dog ignored food and rest, focusing only on digging frantically at a single spot near the foundation of the ruined barn, until his paws were raw and bleeding. Was it the madness of an old animal, or was he sensing something buried deep beneath the earth, a secret that had been forgotten for decades? Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The morning sun, usually a welcome guest in the small kitchen, felt like an interrogator. It cast a harsh, unforgiving light across the stack of envelopes on the old oak table. Each one was a paper wound, stamped with a crimson declaration of urgency. Final notice. Past due. Samuel Peterson, at 72 years old, stared at them not as a collection of bills, but as a final failing report card on his life. A life he had built to be strong, impenetrable, had been brought to its knees by the quiet, creeping costs of a long illness. Mary's illness. At his feet, a silent guardian lay watchful. Ghost, an 11-year-old German shepherd, was a creature of pale smoke and shadows. His once black saddle faded to a soft gray that blended with the white fur of his chest and legs. His intelligent amber eyes, framed by a muzzle now silvered with age, never strayed far from his master. He seemed to understand the oppressive weight that had settled in the house since Mary's passing, a silence that no amount of birdsong from the yard could fill. Samuel ran a hand over his face, the skin weathered and tough like old leather from a life spent outdoors and a youth spent under a harsher sun in the jungles of Vietnam. He was a tall man, still lean, but a stoop had begun to curve his proud Marine's posture, a bend caused not by age, but by grief. His hair, once dark brown, was now a close-cropped field of white. He had faced down enemy fire, had buried friends, had built a family from nothing. But this quiet surrender to a column of numbers felt like the most profound defeat of all. He looked at the phone on the wall, his jaw tightening. A Marine does not ask for help, a man provides. But the man he was supposed to be had failed. He thought of Mary's last whispered words, a plea to keep the family together, and the thought of losing the house, her house, was a betrayal he could not bear. He stood, the scraping of his chair loud in the stillness, and walked to the phone. Ghost's head lifted, his ears swiveling to track the movement. Samuel's hand trembled slightly as he dialed the first number. He swallowed the bitter taste of pride, and when his eldest son answered, his voice was a low, gravelly thing he barely recognized. "Michael," he said, "I need you to come to the house. All of you. There is a family matter to discuss." 3 hours later, 3 expensive cars, a black German sedan, a gleaming white SUV, and a sporty blue coupe crunched one by one onto the gravel driveway. They looked alien against the backdrop of the modest single-story home with its peeling white paint and the sprawling oak tree Samuel and Mary had planted as a sapling 45 years ago. Michael was the first out of his car, a man in his late 40s who looked as if he were assembled from sharp angles and polished surfaces. His tailored suit was immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled, and his eyes held the cool, appraising look of a man who sees everything as an asset or a liability. He was the real estate investor, the one who had turned his father's lessons on strength into a ruthless pursuit of wealth. Next came Sarah, 44, stepping out of her SUV with the careful grace of someone constantly aware of being watched. Her blonde hair was flawless, her designer clothes understated but expensive. She surveyed the old house not with nostalgia, but with a faint, almost imperceptible frown, as if assessing a flaw in her own public image. She was the one who craved status, who had translated her father's emotional distance into a need for external validation. Last was David, the youngest at 38, who emerged from his coupe looking like a man caught in the wrong place. His clothes were fashionable, but lacked the confident edge of his siblings. He avoided eye contact, his gaze flitting from the ground to the roof of the house, anywhere but toward the front door where his father now stood waiting. They gathered in the living room, a space so thick with memories it felt hard to breathe. Photos lined the mantelpiece, a timeline of happier days, school pictures, holidays, weddings. The children sat stiffly on the floral sofa Mary had loved, a piece of furniture that now seemed as out of place as they did. Samuel remained standing. He did not offer them coffee. He did not ask about their lives. He laid the red-stamped envelopes on the coffee table between them. "Your mother's medical bills," he stated, his voice flat. "The bank intends to foreclose." Sarah gasped softly, a hand flying to her mouth. David finally looked at his father, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pity. Michael, however, simply leaned forward and picked up the top letter, scanning it with practiced efficiency. He showed no surprise. He placed the letter down and folded his hands. "I'm aware, Dad," he said, his tone that of a CEO addressing a struggling department. "Which is why I've already taken care of it." A flicker of hope, foolish and desperate, sparked in Samuel's chest. "You paid them?" "In a manner of speaking," Michael said, a thin, cold smile touching his lips. He reached into his leather briefcase and produced a folder of his own, sliding it across the table. "I bought the debt. The loan is now held by my holding company. I am, for all legal purposes, the owner of this property." The words hit Samuel like a physical blow. The air left his lungs. He looked at his other children. Sarah stared at her hands, while David looked at Michael, then quickly away, his face pale. They knew. This was not a rescue. It was a coup. "We have a buyer," Michael continued, his voice devoid of emotion. "A developer looking to build luxury condos. The offer is substantial. After the capital gains taxes and fees, the three of us stand to make a significant profit." "The three of you?" Samuel's voice was a whisper. "This is my home. This was your mother's home?" "And it was a poor investment," Michael countered. "Dad, this is the best-case scenario. We're solving your debt problem and securing a better asset. We've even found a solution for you." He gestured to Sarah. Sarah cleared her throat, finally looking up. "There's that old hunting property up in the Appalachians," she said, her voice strained. "Grandpa's old place. It's been sitting empty for decades, but it's still in the family name. You could live there. It's quiet. Good for retirement." The finality of it, the cold, clinical disposal of him, settled in Samuel's bones. He saw them then, not as his children, but as products of his own making. He had taught them to be strong, to be survivors, to win at all costs. He had drilled discipline into them, but had never shown them tenderness. He had given them a foundation of granite when they had needed fertile soil to grow their hearts. He looked at each of them, his gaze lingering for a long moment. He saw Michael's hunger for approval, Sarah's desperate need for validation, David's paralyzing fear of conflict. He had built this. He had forged these weapons, and now they were pointed back at him. A profound, weary sadness washed over him, extinguishing the last embers of anger. He straightened his back, the old Marine taking over one last time. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken truths. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. He looked directly at Michael, then Sarah, then David. "I was wrong to only teach you how to win." The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, a flicker of something, shame, confusion, crossed David's face. Sarah's carefully constructed composure seemed to crack. Even Michael's cool gaze faltered, just for a second. Then it was over. Michael stood adjusting his cuffs. "The movers will be here in 2 weeks. We'll have the keys to the mountain property sent to you." They left as they came in a procession of expensive metal and quiet efficiency. The sound of their engines faded, leaving a silence deeper and more profound than before. That night, the house felt cavernous. Samuel walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the largest photo, a framed picture of Mary taken 10 years ago, her smile bright, her eyes full of a warmth that he had always relied on to heat their home. He traced the outline of her face with a calloused thumb. "I'm sorry, Mary," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I tried to keep them safe. I tried to make them strong. I didn't know. I didn't know how to do anything else. I couldn't keep our family whole." A wet nose pressed into his hand. He looked down to see Ghost staring up at him, the amber eyes filled with a deep, unwavering loyalty. The dog leaned his heavy head against Samuel's leg, a solid, comforting weight in a world that had just dissolved into ash. Samuel sank into a nearby armchair, pulling the dog's head into his lap, his hand burying itself in the thick, soft fur. The man and his dog sat together in the gathering dark, two solitary figures against the ruins of a family. The journey to the old farm was a slow, grinding ascent, not just through the winding roads of the Appalachian Mountains, but through the layered, dusty decades of Samuel's own memory. The final 2 weeks in the house had been a blur of impersonal cardboard boxes and the hollow sounds of a life being dismantled. The movers, hired by Michael, were efficient and detached, handling the furniture that held 50 years of memories with the same indifference they would give to freight. Samuel had packed only one thing himself, a small cedar chest that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside it lay the few relics he could not part with: the folded flag from his Marine Corps service, his discharge papers from 1973, a handful of medals, and the heavy leather-bound journal he had never taken the time to read. Now the old Ford truck, loaded with the bare essentials of a life reduced to cargo, labored up the incline. Beside him, Ghost sat stoically in the passenger seat, his head held high, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. But every so often, the dog would turn his amber eyes toward Samuel, a soft whine escaping his throat, as if he could sense the turmoil churning behind the old soldier's stony expression. The suburbs of Asheville bled into rolling farmland, which in turn gave way to the dense ancient forests of the mountains. As the road narrowed and the trees closed in, so too did Samuel's thoughts. Each mile marker seemed to peel back a year. He saw his children not as the cold strangers who had exiled him, but as small figures in the rearview mirror of his life. Michael, a serious boy who always tried to show him his perfect report cards, only to receive a curt nod of approval. Sarah, a little girl with bright ribbons in her hair, holding up a drawing that he was too tired or too distracted to truly see. And David, a quiet, sensitive child who learned early that the safest place to be was out of his father's way. He had given them shelter, provided for them, taught them to be tough. He had prepared them for a war, he realized, with a pang of guilt, but not for the world. They stopped for the night at a deserted scenic overlook, the valley below them blanketed in a thick sea of fog. Samuel was too weary to find a motel and too proud to spend the money. He shared a can of beans with Ghost, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of the wind. He tried to sleep in the cramped cab of the truck, but sleep brought no rest. The nightmare was always the same now, not of the humid jungles and the chaos of combat. Those demons had been laid to rest years ago. This was a quieter, more personal hell. In the dream, he was standing in the hallway of his own home, the one he had just left. The house was cavernous and empty, filled with a pale gray light. From the far-off rooms, he could hear the voices of his children, young and clear. "Daddy, where are you?" Michael would call. "Daddy, look what I made," Sarah would plead. "Daddy?" David's small voice would echo, trembling and uncertain. He would try to walk toward them, but his feet were encased in lead. He would try to call out their names, but his throat was filled with dust. He was trapped in the hallway, a silent sentinel in a house full of ghosts, able to hear their need, but completely unable to answer it. He awoke with a jolt, his heart pounding against his ribs. A wet nose was pressing against his cheek. Ghost was leaning over from the passenger seat, whining softly, his warm breath a comfort in the cold pre-dawn air. Samuel reached out and buried his hand in the dog's thick fur, grounding himself in the solid, living presence. "It's all right, boy," he rasped, though he was not sure who he was trying to reassure. The next day, they followed a crudely drawn map Sarah had left for him. The paved road turned to gravel, then to a dirt track barely wide enough for the truck. Finally, they arrived. The farm was less a property and more a scar that nature was patiently trying to heal. The wooden house, built from heavy hand-hewn logs, sagged in the middle, its porch slanted like a broken jaw. Windows were shattered, and the roof was a patchwork of moss and missing shingles. The barn beside it had collapsed entirely into a heap of weathered gray timber. The fields were choked with weeds and saplings. Ghost leaped from the truck as soon as the door opened, but he did not bound off to explore. He moved with the careful, deliberate pace of a soldier scouting hostile territory, his nose to the ground, circling the house and the outbuildings, establishing a perimeter. He was on duty. Samuel stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He felt the weight of decades of neglect pressing down on him. This was not a new beginning. It was a graveyard of someone else's. He pushed open the front door, which groaned in protest, and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of dust, damp wood, and animal droppings. But beneath it all, there was the faint, sweet scent of cedar. He moved through the two small rooms, his boots stirring up clouds of dust. In a corner, he saw the cedar chest he had packed. It was the only thing in the room that seemed whole. With Ghost now sitting watchfully at the doorway, Samuel knelt and opened the chest. He bypassed the medals and the military papers, his fingers searching for the heavy journal. He settled onto the floor, leaning his back against the cold stone of the fireplace, and opened the book. The handwriting was neat, the ink faded but clear. It was his grandfather's story, written not as a great history, but as a simple record of a life. Samuel read of the back-breaking labor of clearing the land and building the cabin. He read of the harsh winters and the joyful springs. But what struck him, what tightened his chest with an emotion he could not name, were the entries about his family. December 24, 1935. Mary Ann made a fine stew for Christmas Eve. Little Thomas helped me carve a wooden bird for his mother. To see the pride on that boy's face is a greater gift than any king could receive. May 10, 1938. The new filly was born today. I let Thomas name her. He chose Starlight. My son has his mother's gentle heart. I pray he keeps it always. He read of a man who built a home with his hands and filled it with his heart. Samuel felt a pang of shame. He had commanded a house but had never truly built a home. His own memories of fatherhood were a collection of missed moments, of discipline given where understanding was needed, of silence where there should have been praise. Then he saw it with a blinding, painful clarity. Mary? Mary had been the bridge. She was the one who translated his gruff nods into praise for the children. She was the one who explained to him that Michael's relentless ambition was a desperate plea for his approval. She was the one who knew Sarah's obsession with appearances came from feeling invisible at home. She was the one who protected David from the harshness she knew Samuel never intended. She had stood in the middle, her arms outstretched, holding the family together. He had stood on one side, the stoic provider, and the children on the other, wanting a father he did not know how to be. When she was gone, the bridge collapsed, leaving them all stranded on opposite sides of a silent, impassable chasm. His harshness, his silence, his emotional distance, it wasn't strength, as he had always told himself. It was a wall, a pathetic wall he had built, brick by brick, to hide his own helplessness, his own fear that he did not have the right words, the right heart, to be the father they deserved. The journal slipped from his fingers, falling open on the dusty floorboards. The sun was setting, casting long, orange shadows through the broken windows. The weight of his failure was absolute. He was 72 years old, an exile in a forgotten land, haunted by the ghosts of a family he had lost long before they had sent him away. A heavy head settled onto his knee. Ghost looked up at him, his gaze soft and knowing. Samuel slowly lowered his hand, his fingers tangling in the fur behind the dog's ears. The old man and his dog sat together in the ruins, surrounded by the echoes of a past Samuel finally understood. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last, measured only by the rising and setting of a sun that seemed indifferent to the man below. Life on the farm was a relentless, grinding struggle. Samuel's mornings were spent patching the leaky roof with salvaged sheets of tin from the collapsed barn. His afternoons were for clearing the thick, stubborn weeds that had claimed the land, and his evenings were for setting snares in the woods, hoping to catch a rabbit for the next day's meal. The work was hard, physical, and honest, and it should have been healing, but it was not. The labor only served to exhaust his body, leaving his mind vulnerable to the ghosts that came with the night. In the crushing silence of the cabin, loneliness was a physical presence, a cold weight on his chest. He would sit for hours staring into the fire he had built, seeing not the dancing flames, but the disappointed faces of his children, the sorrow in his wife's eyes. He ate without tasting, he worked without purpose, and he spoke less and less, his voice rusting from disuse. The Dan vat, the torment he felt, was no longer a sharp pain but a dull, constant ache that had settled deep in his soul. He was not living. He was simply enduring. And Ghost watched it all. The old dog, whose world revolved entirely around the man sitting by the fire, sensed the slow decay. He saw the way his master's shoulders slumped a little lower each week. He smelled the change in him, the scent of grief souring into a scent of surrender. He saw the uneaten portions of food, the new hollowness in the man's cheeks. Ghost's world was shrinking, the light at its center dimming, and a deep, canine instinct to protect his pack of one, rose within him. His daily patrols of the property, once a calm, methodical routine, became more urgent, more focused. He was no longer just watching for threats. He was searching for a solution. He began to spend hours near the ruins of the old barn, a place Samuel largely avoided. It was a chaotic mess of fallen timbers and overgrown vines, but something beneath it all had captured the dog's unwavering attention. At first, it was just a faint curiosity, a scent that was different from the usual woodland smells of damp earth, decaying leaves, and wild animals. This was something else. It was the deep mineral tang of earth that had been dug and moved long ago, a scent that held the memory of human hands. And woven through it, almost imperceptibly faint, was another smell. It was a strange, sweet aroma, like fruit left to ferment, mixed with the sharp, almost medicinal bite of alcohol that had long since evaporated, leaving only a ghost of itself trapped in the soil. Soon, Ghost's curiosity turned into an obsession. He would spend the better part of the day in that one spot, just past the barn's stone foundation, his nose pressed to the ground, sniffing, whining softly. Then he began to dig. "Ghost, leave it," Samuel would call out, his voice tired and flat. "Just a groundhog, boy. You are wasting your energy." But Ghost would not leave it. The dog's persistence grew in proportion to Samuel's apathy. He started ignoring his food bowl, his ribs beginning to show beneath his thick coat. He would dig until his paws were scraped and raw, stopping only to look back at the cabin, letting out a sharp, pleading bark. He was no longer just digging. He was communicating, insisting, begging his master to pay attention. The sight of his dog, his loyal and steadfast friend, wasting away in pursuit of some phantom in the dirt, was the one thing that could still pierce through the thick fog of Samuel's despair. Concern for Ghost became the first real emotion he had felt in weeks, a sharp, protective instinct that overrode his own desire to simply fade away. One afternoon, after watching Ghost refuse his food and return immediately to his frantic digging, something inside Samuel finally snapped. It was not a return of hope, but a surge of frustrated love for his dog. "All right, that is enough," he growled, pushing himself to his feet. "Enough, you stubborn old hound. I will prove to you there is nothing there." He grabbed a rusted shovel that had been leaning against the cabin wall and marched toward the barn. Ghost watched him approach, his tail giving a hopeful, tentative thump against the dirt. Samuel plunged the shovel into the spot where the dog had been digging. The work was hard. The ground was packed tight, interwoven with a thick web of roots. For half an hour he dug, the rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel the only sound. The physical exertion brought sweat to his brow and a welcome burn to his muscles, a real tangible feeling that pushed back against the numbness inside him. He was doing this for his dog, he told himself, just to put an end to this foolishness. Then, with a dull thud that vibrated up the handle of the shovel, he hit something hard. It was not the sharp crack of striking a rock. It was a solid, resonant impact, the sound of metal hitting wood. He stopped, breathing heavily. Curiosity, an emotion he thought had died in him, flickered to life. He dug around the point of impact, clearing away more soil. Ghost, sensing the change, began digging alongside him with renewed vigor, sending sprays of dirt flying with his paws. They worked together now, a frantic, focused team of man and dog. Slowly, an outline began to emerge. It was not a rock or a tree root. It was the straight, unmistakable edge of a thick wooden plank. Samuel's heart began to beat a little faster. He kept digging, uncovering another plank, and then another. An entire section of dark, heavy wood was set into the ground, reinforced with straps of rusted iron. And in the center of it, almost completely buried, was a heavy ringed handle. It was a door, a large, heavy cellar door hidden beneath the earth. He dropped the shovel, sinking to his knees. He was covered in sweat and dirt, his muscles aching, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the impossible thing he had just uncovered. Then he looked at Ghost. The dog was panting, his tongue lolling out, his tail sweeping back and forth in a triumphant arc. His paws were muddy, but his eyes were bright and clear, fixed on Samuel with an expression of pure, unadulterated faith. The despair that had been Samuel's constant companion had not vanished. The grief and regret were still there, waiting in the shadows. But for the first time since he had arrived in this land of memory and regret, they were no longer the only things he could feel. Staring at the hidden door, a single sharp ray of hope pierced through the darkness, as astonishing and as welcome as the sun breaking through a storm. The struggle to open the door was a battle against time itself. The iron ring, thick with rust, refused to budge, and the heavy oak planks seemed to have fused with the damp earth surrounding them. Samuel heaved and pulled, his muscles straining, the breath burning in his lungs. Ghost, sensing the climax of their efforts, whined with a low, urgent hum, his paws digging at the dirt around the door's edge. Finally, with a great groan of protesting wood and a screech of tortured metal, the door lifted a few inches, releasing a puff of air from the darkness below. It was an ancient breath, cool and musty, carrying the scent of deep, undisturbed earth, cellar damp, and something else, something sweet and sharp that pricked at Samuel's memory. Using a fallen log as a lever, he managed to pry the door fully open, revealing a steep flight of stone steps descending into blackness. He retrieved a heavy flashlight from his truck, its beam cutting a nervous white circle into the gloom. "Stay here, boy," he commanded, but Ghost paid no mind, pressing close behind him as if tethered by an invisible line. They descended together, the man and his dog, stepping out of the bright afternoon sun and into the past. The air grew cold and still. The flashlight beam danced across damp stone walls, then swept across the room. In the center, like a sleeping bronze giant, stood a magnificent copper pot still, its surface covered in a beautiful green patina of age. All around it lay the ghosts of an operation frozen in time, dusty sacks of corn and grain that had long since collapsed into fine powder, stacks of empty glass mason jars, and tools of a trade Samuel had only ever heard about in old family stories. It was a complete Prohibition-era distillery, a secret world hidden beneath the ruins of the farm. And then he saw them. Lining the far wall were the barrels, dozens of them, stacked 2 and 3 high in neat rows. A jolt of pure, unadulterated excitement shot through Samuel, a feeling so foreign he almost stumbled. This was it, a treasure, a way out of the darkness. He rushed forward, his earlier weariness forgotten. He ran his hand over the first barrel, the wood rough and splintered. He rapped his knuckles against it. The sound was hollow, empty. His smile faltered. He moved to the next one, and the one after that. Hollow, hollow, hollow. His heart began to sink. He found one that felt heavy, but as his light traced its side, he saw the dark, ugly stain on the stone floor beneath it, the telltale sign of a leak that had bled the barrel dry decades ago. He moved down the row, his initial excitement curdling into a familiar, bitter disappointment. The majority of the barrels were either empty, rotted through, or had clearly fallen victim to the slow, relentless destruction of time. The treasure was an illusion. The cellar was not a vault. It was a tomb filled with the dusty bones of a failed enterprise. He slumped against the cold stone wall, the flashlight beam aimed at the floor, his grand discovery now feeling like the cruelest joke of all. He had been a fool to hope. Ghost, sensing his master's renewed despair, came and nudged his hand, whining softly. "It's nothing, boy," Samuel muttered. "Just more ghosts." But as he sat there, his light cast a faint glow on a far corner of the cellar, a section he had not yet explored. There, tucked away under a low stone archway that was clearly the oldest part of the foundation, sat a much smaller stack of barrels. There were perhaps only a dozen of them. They looked different from the others. The wood was a darker, richer color, and the iron hoops around them, while rusted, were still solid and intact. A tiny, reluctant spark of curiosity compelled him to get up and take a closer look. These barrels felt different, more solid, the craftsmanship finer. He tapped one. It replied with a deep, resonant, and unmistakably full sound. He found a small, spigot-like tool on a nearby shelf. A whiskey thief, his grandfather had called it in his journal, and with trembling hands, he managed to work it into the bunghole of the top barrel. He drew out a sample, the dark liquid sloshing inside the glass tube. He carried it upstairs as if it were a holy relic, stepping back into the warm sunlight. He found a small, clean glass and poured the contents. The liquid was a stunningly deep amber, almost the color of molasses, and it clung to the side of the glass. He brought it to his nose, inhaling an aroma so complex it made him dizzy. Rich vanilla and burnt caramel, the scent of old leather, a hint of pipe tobacco, and a deep, smoky sweetness. It was the smell of time itself. With a hand that was not entirely steady, he took a small sip. The liquid coated his tongue, not with the harsh burn of cheap moonshine, but with a warmth that was smooth, profound, and utterly astonishing. It was powerful, yes, but it was also elegant. Flavors of dark chocolate, dried fruit, and toasted oak unfolded in his mouth, leaving a finish that was long, warm, and smoky. He had drunk good whiskey in his life, but this was something else entirely. This was not a drink, it was a story. He stumbled back into the cabin, his mind racing, and fumbled for his grandfather's journal. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the neat script, searching for an answer. And then he found it, in an entry dated from the fall of 1932, October 5th, 1932. The main run is aging well, but I have a mind to try something for the ages. The government men are clever, but time is more patient. I have felled a white oak from the North Ridge, where the trees grow slow and the grain is tight. I have charred the staves deeper than is usual. Today, I filled the 12 special barrels with the heart of the summer corn run. I am placing them in the old stone corner of the cellar, where the air is coldest and the seasons do not touch it. My theory is that the deep cold will slow the aging to a crawl. It may not be ready in my lifetime, or even my son's. But perhaps one day someone will open these barrels and taste not just whiskey, but the very soul of this mountain. Samuel read the passage 3 times. It was an experiment, a legacy deliberately set aside, a message in a bottle sent floating down the river of time. The failed barrels in the main room were not a disappointment. They were the control group. They were the proof of his grandfather's genius. The real treasure was not the whiskey itself, but the knowledge, the patience, and the foresight that had gone into creating it. He looked at the glass of amber liquid glowing in the afternoon light. This was not a quick score, a stack of cash to solve his problems. This was a responsibility. It was a craft, a history, a work of art that had been entrusted to him. The weight of his own failures, his regrets, did not disappear, but they were joined by a new, heavier weight. The duty to be a worthy guardian of this improbable, imperfect, and magnificent legacy. For the first time in a very long time, Samuel Peterson felt a sense of purpose. He had a job to do. The morning after the discovery, Samuel awoke not to the familiar heavy blanket of despair, but to a sharp, unfamiliar sense of urgency. For the first time in months, he did not lie in his cot, watching the slow crawl of dawn across the rough-hewn walls. He rose before the sun, his movements crisp and defined by a purpose that had been absent for far too long. In the pale pre-dawn light, the world felt different, charged with possibility. He had a mission. The work of restoration became his therapy, a ritual that healed him one task at a time. The cellar, once a tomb of forgotten dreams, transformed into his sanctuary. Each day he would descend the stone steps, with Ghost padding silently behind him, and the ghosts in his mind would recede, silenced by the demands of the tangible world. His first task was the great copper still. It was covered in a thick, dark layer of grime and oxidation, the accumulation of half a century of neglect. With a bucket of water from the creek, a soft cloth, and a pot of polish he concocted from wood ash and vinegar, he began to clean. At first, the work was slow and frustrating, but as he rubbed, a small patch of the metal began to glow with a warm, rosy light. He focused on that small patch, rubbing in slow, deliberate circles. His mind, which had been a chaotic storm of regret and what-ifs, became quiet, narrowed to the simple, physical act. The repetitive motion was a meditation. The gradual transformation of the metal from dull green to brilliant copper was a tangible victory in a life that had felt like nothing but defeat. He talked to Ghost as he worked, his voice filling the quiet space. "See this, boy? This is a condenser coil. Cools the vapor, turns it back into liquid. Pure magic, if you ask me." Ghost would lie on a clean piece of burlap near the steps, his head on his paws, his amber eyes following Samuel's every move. He was a silent, attentive audience, his presence a steady anchor in Samuel's solitary world. Days turned into a week. The still began to gleam, its polished surface reflecting a distorted image of the man who was bringing it back to life. Samuel saw in the copper a man he barely recognized, gaunt and gray, yes, but with a focus in his eyes, a set to his jaw, that had been missing. He was rediscovering the man he used to be, the Marine Corps mechanic who could diagnose an engine by sound, the man who knew how to make broken things work again. The self-respect of a skilled craftsman, long buried under layers of grief and failure, was slowly being unearthed. The hard physical labor was a balm. The ache in his back from hauling away rotted barrels, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the grease under his fingernails. These were clean, honest pains. They were the price of progress, and they chased away the other intangible aches of the soul. When he was focused on threading a new pipe or soldering a leak, he was not thinking of Michael's cold eyes or Sarah's dismissive tone. The clank of a wrench against metal was louder than the memory of his own harsh words. He was distilling his own soul, boiling away the impurities of regret, leaving behind something stronger, something purer. It was during these long days of shared labor that he began to notice the small, subtle signs of time's march on his companion. In the crisp morning air, as they left the cabin, he saw that Ghost took a moment longer to rise, stretching a hind leg that seemed a little stiff. When the dog sat in a patch of sunlight streaming into the cellar, the light illuminated the silver that now heavily frosted his once dark muzzle, making him look noble and ancient. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of clearing a collapsed section of the cellar wall, Samuel sank onto the porch steps, every muscle in his body protesting. Ghost, equally weary, limped over and collapsed at his feet with a heavy sigh, his breathing deep and slow. Samuel reached down and began to massage the dog's hip, his fingers working into the thick fur and tired muscle. He felt a slight tremor in the old leg. He looked down at his friend, truly looked, and saw not just the loyal guardian, but an 11-year-old animal heading into the twilight of his life. The realization struck him with a force that took his breath away. His own time was limited, he knew that, but Ghost's was so much more finite. A wave of cold, sharp fear washed over him, a terror far greater than any he had felt for himself. The thought of this farm, this world, without the steady, comforting presence of Ghost, was an emptiness he could not bear to contemplate. The silence in the cabin was already deafening, a silence without the soft thump of Ghost's tail or the sound of his quiet breathing would be absolute. In that moment, everything crystallized. His mission was no longer just about honoring his grandfather's legacy or even about healing his own broken spirit. It was for Ghost. All of this, the back-breaking work, the restoration, the desperate hope for the future, was to build a safe, warm, and peaceful final chapter for the one creature on Earth who had given him nothing but unconditional loyalty. He owed it to his dog to make these last years comfortable and secure. He had failed his human family. He would not fail his pack. This new, fierce motivation propelled him forward. The next day, he worked with a renewed intensity. He was no longer just restoring a distillery. He was building a fortress against the future, a haven for his aging friend. The work was no longer a therapy for the past, but an investment in the precious, limited time they had left. That night, as Ghost slept soundly by the newly swept hearth, his leg twitching as he dreamed of chasing rabbits, Samuel stood in the doorway, looking from the sleeping dog to the dark outline of the mountains. He made a silent vow, a promise whispered into the vast, starry emptiness of the Appalachian night. He would make this place work. He would create something lasting from the ashes. He would build a home so solid and a future so secure that his old friend would know nothing but peace and comfort for the rest of his days. The legacy of the still and the life of his dog were now inextricably linked, a single, clear purpose that lit the way forward. The restoration of the still had reached an impasse. Samuel stood in the cellar, wiping grease from his hands with a rag, staring at a section of copper tubing that was corroded beyond repair. He needed new pipes, specific fittings, and a pressure gauge that actually worked. His grandfather's ingenuity could only take him so far. Some things simply had to be bought. The thought of leaving his mountain sanctuary and engaging with the world was deeply unwelcome, but his dwindling supplies of flour, coffee, and dog food made the trip a necessity. His purpose was now too strong to be derailed by a lack of parts or an empty pantry. The next morning, he coaxed the old Ford truck to life. Ghost, sensing an unusual excursion, hopped into the passenger seat with an air of dignified importance, his head held high as they rumbled down the winding dirt track. The journey down the mountain felt like a descent into a foreign country. After weeks of hearing only the wind in the trees and the cry of hawks, the sounds of traffic and civilization felt jarring and loud. The town, nestled in a valley 20 miles away, was called Harmony Creek. It was a small, tight-knit place where family names went back generations, and a new face was an event. As Samuel's dusty, unfamiliar truck rolled down the main street, curtains twitched in windows. Men sitting on the bench outside the general store paused their conversations, their gazes following the truck with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Samuel felt their eyes on him, the familiar feeling of being an outsider, a ghost passing through. He parked in front of a long, single-story building with a faded sign that read, Ethan's Hardware and Supply. He gave Ghost a firm command to stay, leaving the window cracked for the warm autumn air. The dog lay down on the seat, ever watchful, a portrait of calm obedience. The inside of the store smelled of sawdust, oil, and old iron. It was a labyrinth of neatly organized tools, plumbing fixtures, and farming supplies. Behind a long wooden counter stood a man in his late 30s, lean and wiry, with a friendly but tired face. A faded tattoo of an eagle and parachute peeked out from the sleeve of his flannel shirt. This was Ethan, the store's owner. The initial exchange was polite, but distant. Samuel, unaccustomed to conversation, stated his needs with military brevity. Need a 1/4-inch copper coil, 2 pressure gauges, 0 to 30 psi, and some brass fittings. Ethan nodded, his expression professional. I should have the fittings and the coil. Gauges might be a special order. As he turned to check his inventory, a young boy, no older than 7, who had been in the store with his mother, wandered outside, drawn by the sight of the big dog in the old truck. The mother, a nervous-looking woman, started to follow him. "Ma'am, he is all right," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble. "He is gentle, is." Through the large storefront window, they all watched as the boy reached a tentative hand through the open truck window. Ghost, instead of barking, simply leaned forward and graced the boy's fingers with a soft, gentle lick. The boy giggled, and after a moment of hesitation, his mother relaxed. The silent judgment in the store softened, just a fraction. An animal that well-behaved had to belong to a decent man. Ethan had watched the entire interaction, a thoughtful look on his face. When he returned with the copper coil, his demeanor had changed. "That is a fine-looking German shepherd," he said. "He is a good dog," Samuel replied simply. Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes holding a new, knowing light. "You handle him with a certain economy of motion. It reminds me of the handlers I knew in the service." It was not quite a question, but an open door. Samuel met his gaze. The tattoo on Ethan's arm was from the 82nd Airborne Division. "Marines, 1969 to 1973, Samuel said. A look of profound understanding passed between them. The barrier of suspicion dissolved, replaced by the unspoken brotherhood of shared experience. "Afghanistan," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. 2009 to 2013. It takes a while for the noise to go away, does not it? "It never really does," Samuel admitted. "You just find a quieter place to listen to it." They talked for nearly an hour about the jarring return to civilian life, about the difficulty of explaining things that no one who had not been there could ever understand. For the first time in years, Samuel spoke to another man, not as a customer or a stranger, but as a comrade. Buoyed by this unexpected connection, he decided to take a risk. "There is something I would like to show you," Samuel said, "if you have a minute." Outside, by the truck, Samuel retrieved a small unmarked flask from his jacket. He poured a small amount into the cap and handed it to Ethan. "From my grandfather's cellar," was all he said. Ethan sniffed it, his eyebrows rising in surprise. He took a sip. His eyes went wide. He savored it for a long moment before letting out a low whistle. "My God, man! I have never tasted anything like this. What is it?" Samuel told him the whole story, the cellar, the still, the journal, the few perfect barrels. He also explained his new purpose and the seemingly insurmountable wall of laws and regulations he knew he would face if he tried to sell it. Ethan listened intently, his gaze drifting from Samuel's face to the stoic dog in the truck and back again. When Samuel finished, Ethan stared off into the distance for a moment, thinking. "You are right," he said finally. "The TTB and the State Liquor Board will bury you in paperwork for years. The licensing fees alone could sink you before you even start. It is a bureaucratic war, and they have all the reinforcements." Samuel's shoulders sagged. It was just as he had feared. "But," Ethan continued, a clever glint in his eye, "they have rules for distilleries. They have different rules for estates." He leaned in conspiratorially. "You are not a commercial distiller yet, Sam. You are the sole heir of an estate. And this," he tapped the flask, "is a rare inherited asset. A private collection. There is nothing illegal about the private liquidation of inherited property to settle the affairs of an estate." The idea was a lifeline. It was a way to turn his grandfather's legacy into the capital he desperately needed, all while staying on the right side of the law. "It would buy you time," Ethan explained. "And money. Enough to start the real fight, the right way. Enough to hire a lawyer who knows how to navigate that mess. My cousin, he is a lawyer over in the next county. He is sharp, and he understands how things work up here in the mountains." Samuel left Harmony Creek an hour later, the bed of his truck loaded with copper pipes, new tools, and enough supplies to last a month. But he carried with him something far more valuable. He had an ally. He had a plan. And he had a bridge back to the world, a bridge built on a shared past and a sip of whiskey, a century in the making. The road ahead was still long and fraught with challenges. The war against bureaucracy had just begun, and it would be a battle of attrition, fought with forms and permits instead of rifles. But as he drove back up the mountain, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the peaks, he no longer felt like he was fighting it alone. He reached over and scratched Ghost behind the ears. The dog leaned into his touch with a contented sigh. "Well, boy," Samuel said, a hint of a smile touching his lips for the first time in a very long time. "I think we just made a friend." The wheels of progress, once sluggish and stuck in the mud of despair, now turned with a steady, determined momentum. Ethan, true to his word, had put Samuel in touch with his cousin, a lawyer named Martha Hayes, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a keen understanding of mountain ways and legal loopholes. Martha helped Samuel navigate the complexities of labeling and packaging the inherited whiskey as a private estate liquidation. It was a tedious process, but one that Samuel now approached with the same methodical discipline he once applied to military operations. Every form, every label, every seal was placed with precision. He named the collection Ghost's Reserve. The name was not merely a tribute to his loyal companion, it was a subtle nod to the ethereal nature of the whiskey itself, a spirit almost lost to time, brought back by a silent guardian. The labels were simple, hand-drawn by Samuel himself, depicting the silhouette of a German shepherd against the outline of the Appalachian peaks, with the words, Ghost's Reserve. Esterman, 1932, etched below. The first 6 bottles, carefully filled from one of the precious, perfectly aged barrels, were delivered by Ethan to a boutique liquor store in Asheville called the Connoisseur's Cellar. The owner, Mr. Elias Vance, a man with a meticulously trimmed beard and an encyclopedic knowledge of fine spirits, was initially skeptical. But one sip of Ghost's Reserve was enough to turn skepticism into awe. "My word," Mr. Vance breathed, his eyes wide. This is a relic, a living legend in a bottle. Where did you find this?" Ethan, with Samuel's permission, shared a carefully curated version of the story. An old Marine inherited a mountain farm, found a forgotten cellar, a loyal dog. The tale, combined with the unparalleled quality of the whiskey, was irresistible. Mr. Vance purchased all 6 bottles on the spot and immediately began to spread the word among his most discerning clientele. Word travels fast in the world of high-end spirits, and even faster when a good story is attached. Within weeks, Samuel was receiving calls on the old rotary phone Ethan had helped him install. Collectors from Raleigh, Charleston, even as far as Atlanta, were calling that old place on the mountain, wanting to secure a bottle of the mythical Ghost's Reserve. Ethan started taking a small negotiated percentage of the sales, using his truck to deliver bottles and collect payments. He became Samuel's link to the outside world, a trusted contact who handled the logistics, while Samuel remained largely on the mountain, protecting his solitude and his purpose. The money started to come in, not a flood, but a steady, respectable stream. Enough to replace the leaky roof, enough to buy proper lumber to shore up the barn, enough to buy the best quality dog food for Ghost, and a comfortable, warm bed for his old friend. Enough to finally buy the necessary parts for the still and begin the long, arduous process of applying for a micro-distillery license, a battle that Martha Hayes was now spearheading. Samuel's life transformed. He was no longer just surviving, he was building. He spent his days in the cellar, carefully tending to the precious remaining barrels, understanding that each bottle sold was not just a transaction, but a piece of history finding a new home. He also spent time in the woods, foraging for local berries and wild herbs, beginning to experiment with smaller batches of moonshine, guided by his grandfather's notes. He was teaching himself the craft, preparing for the day he could legally distill his own spirits. A new legacy for a new era. The mountain air, once thick with his despair, now carried the faint, sweet scent of fermenting corn. The old cabin, once a symbol of his exile, now felt like a bastion, a place of peace and purpose. He had found his rhythm, a quiet harmony with the land and the task at hand. Yet, despite the newfound financial security and the sense of accomplishment, the quiet ache of loneliness persisted. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the rugged peaks, painting the sky in fiery hues, Samuel would sit on his newly repaired porch. Ghost would be at his feet, his head resting on Samuel's knee, his breathing slow and even. The familiar comfort of the dog's presence was a steady warmth, but it could not entirely fill the cavernous space in his heart. He often looked out at the vast, silent wilderness. He had built this with Ghost's help. He had brought a forgotten legacy back to life. He was providing for himself and for his loyal companion. But there was no one to share it with. No one to taste the first successful batch of experimental spirit he had just run. No one to laugh with at Ghost's antics. No one to discuss the intricate flavor notes with. The success, while gratifying, felt hollow in its solitude. He would sometimes pull out the faded photo of Mary, the one he kept in his chest pocket. He would trace her smile, wishing she were there to see it all, to tell him he had done well, to bridge the gap, as she always had, between his stoic pride and the joy he couldn't quite express. He often imagined what she would say about the whiskey, about the old cabin, about Ghost. He pictured her gentle hands reaching out to stroke the dog's head, and then his thoughts would inevitably drift to his children. He wondered if they ever thought of him beyond the initial cold calculations of his departure. Did they ever wonder about this mountain, about the old man they had sent away? Did they ever consider that the man who now commanded the attention of whiskey connoisseurs was the same father they had so easily dismissed? He knew the answer was likely no. They were busy with their own lives, their own pursuits, just as he had been busy with his own pursuits when they were young. The cycle of distance seemed unbroken. Ghost, sensing the familiar cloud of melancholy descending upon his master, would stir. He would shift his head, press a little harder against Samuel's leg, and let out a soft, almost imperceptible sigh, a wordless offering of comfort. Samuel would reach down, his hand finding the familiar, soft fur. "Just us, boy," he'd murmur into the gathering dusk. "Just us." The words were a statement of fact, but also a poignant reminder of the enduring truth. His success had brought him everything he needed, except for the family he yearned to share it with. The whispers from the mountain, though, were reaching further than he knew. The whispers from the mountain had become shouts in the world below. Samuel knew with the weary certainty of an old soldier that it was only a matter of time before the noise reached the ears of his children. He did not have to wait long. It was a crisp afternoon in late autumn. Samuel was splitting firewood near the cabin, the rhythmic thud of the axe a familiar comfort. Ghost lay nearby in a patch of sun, dozing lightly, his ears twitching at the sound of a distant blue jay. Suddenly the dog's head shot up, his body instantly alert. A low, deep rumble started in his chest, a sound Samuel had not heard since the last time he had seen his children. A moment later, Samuel heard it too, the sound of powerful engines straining against the mountain road. He set the axe down just as the first car, Michael's black sedan, appeared around the bend, its polished surface a jarring intrusion against the rustic landscape. It was followed by Sarah's white SUV and David's blue coupe. They parked in a neat, imposing line, the same way they had parked in the driveway of his old home. It felt like an invasion. They stepped out of their cars, dressed in expensive weekend attire that looked more suited to a country club than a working farm. They brought the scent of the city with them, perfume, leather, ambition. "Dad," Michael called out, forcing a smile that did not reach his cold, appraising eyes. "We came as soon as we heard. We were worried sick about you up here all alone," Sarah chimed in, her voice a little too bright. "We have been reading about you. It is quite the story they are telling." Ghost had not moved from Samuel's side. He stood stiffly, a silent gray and white statue, the low growl in his chest a constant vibrating warning. Samuel placed a calming hand on the dog's back. He led them not into the cabin, but to the porch. He remained standing as they arranged themselves on the steps, their discomfort with the rustic setting palpable. Michael, never one for pleasantries, got straight to the point. He opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a bound document with a glossy cover. "Dad, what you have here is incredible. A fantastic product with an even better backstory. But you are managing it on a micro scale. I have drafted a business plan to take Ghost's Reserve to the next level." He spoke of trademarks, of scaling production, of distribution networks and marketing strategies. He talked about leveraging the authentic veteran narrative to appeal to a wider demographic. His words were sharp, precise, and completely devoid of soul. Sarah jumped in when he finished, her eyes gleaming with a different kind of hunger. "And think of the tourism potential. We could build a proper tasting room, a small visitors center, offer curated mountain experiences. It would be an exclusive luxury brand. People will pay a fortune for this kind of authenticity." David, as always, provided the weak echo. "It is a great opportunity, Dad. We could all be a part of it, a real family business." Samuel listened to it all, his face a granite mask. The silence stretched after they finished their pitch, broken only by the wind in the pines and the low, steady growl from the dog at his side. He looked at them, at their expensive clothes and their eager, hungry faces, and he felt a profound, aching pity. "You are not here because you were worried," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "You are here because you smelled money, the same way you smelled it when you sold your mother's house." Michael bristled. "That is unfair. We are trying to help you, to secure your future." "My future is secure," Samuel said, gesturing to the sturdy cabin, the neat stacks of firewood, the clear, clean air. "I have everything I need right here." He then looked at each of them, his gaze piercing. "You are more like me than you think, always looking for something on the outside to fill the emptiness on the inside." The words struck a nerve. Michael's face hardened with anger, Sarah's with indignation. David simply flinched, looking down at his shoes. "How dare you?" Sarah began, her voice trembling. "After everything we have done." "What have you done?" Samuel cut her off, his voice rising for the first time. "You took your mother's home. You left me with the keys to a ruin. You did not call. You did not write. You waited until the world told you that your broken old father had something of value, and you came running back like vultures to a carcass." The accusation hung in the air, raw and brutal. The carefully constructed facades of his children began to crack. Michael stood up, his fists clenched. "We gave you a chance to live your life with dignity instead of drowning in debt." It was then that Sarah broke. The years of curated poise, of maintaining a perfect image, shattered into a million pieces. A wrenching sob escaped her, a sound of pure, unfiltered anguish. Tears streamed down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. "Dignity?" she shrieked, her voice raw with a pain that went far beyond business plans and property values. She gestured wildly at the cabin, the mountains, at Samuel himself. "What does any of this matter? This family fell apart years ago?" She turned on Samuel, her face a mask of grief. "Since Mom died, our house has not been a home." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. The business proposal, the arguments, the anger, all of it evaporated, revealed as the petty squabbling it was. Sarah's cry was the real truth, the open, gaping wound at the center of their family. It was an accusation that struck them all, Samuel included. They were all lost children, wandering through the ruins of a home that had lost its heart. In that moment of pure, emotional chaos, Sarah's heartbroken sobs, Michael's stunned silence, David's quiet tears, and Samuel's own crushing wave of sorrow, Ghost made his move. He stepped forward, away from the safety of Samuel's side, and deliberately placed himself in the open space between the father and his 3 children. He did not bark. He did not lunge. His head was low, his body tense, and the growl in his chest deepened into a low, mournful hum. It was not a sound of aggression. Samuel, who knew the dog's language better than his own, understood instantly. Ghost was not sensing a physical threat. He was reacting to the storm of human emotion, the overwhelming, toxic wave of pain, grief, and chaos that had just erupted. He was a guardian standing vigil, not against an enemy, but against the family's own shared agony. The chapter ended in that terrible, ringing silence, punctuated only by Sarah's weeping. The plans were forgotten, the arguments meaningless. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of their brokenness, with a loyal old dog standing guard over the pieces. The silence that followed Sarah's cry was heavier and more suffocating than any storm. The wind began to pick up, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the grief that had just been laid bare. The sky, which had been a clear autumn blue moments before, was now bruised with dark, fast-moving clouds rolling in over the mountain peaks. Ghost, who had been standing as a stoic guardian between the broken family members, suddenly shifted his attention. He let out a low, anxious whine, his ears flattening against his skull as he looked from the darkening sky to the low-lying ground where the barn and the cellar entrance sat. He knew the language of the mountain better than any of them, and he was sensing a deep atmospheric shift. Samuel, with a lifetime of reading the land, recognized the signs instantly. The sudden drop in temperature, the metallic scent in the air, the agitated behavior of the birds in the trees. This was not just a rainstorm. This was a deluge in the making, the kind that could turn the gentle creek into a raging, destructive torrent. "A flash flood is coming," he said, his voice cutting through the emotional haze. "We have to secure the cellar. Now." His children stared at him, still lost in their own worlds of anger and shock. "It is just some rain, Dad," Michael scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension, though his eyes were still red-rimmed from the confrontation. Samuel did not have time to argue. The first fat, cold drops of rain began to fall, splattering against the dusty porch like dark accusations. "You can argue with me later. You cannot argue with the mountain." He turned and ran, not with the speed of a young man, but with the urgent, efficient purpose of a soldier. He sprinted to the cellar, wrenching open the heavy door he had so recently uncovered. His first priority was not the barrels, but the legacy. He scrambled down the steps and grabbed the two things that could never be replaced: his grandfather's leather-bound journal and a small wooden box containing the most delicate, custom-made parts of the still. He shoved them into David's unresisting hands. "Take these inside the cabin. Do not let them get wet." By the time he emerged from the cellar, the rain was falling in blinding horizontal sheets. The gentle creek at the edge of the property was already beginning to swell, its clear water turning a muddy, angry brown. The main flow was heading directly for the barn. He reverted to the man he had been in 1971, the Marine sergeant who had to lead frightened young men through chaos. His voice became a bark, sharp and clear above the roar of the wind and rain. "Michael, David, those old logs by the woodpile. We need a diversion wall, right here." He pointed to a spot upstream from the barn. "Sarah, in the barn there are burlap sacks. Fill them with dirt as fast as you can." For a moment they hesitated, a trio of city dwellers frozen by the elemental fury. But the raw, unquestionable authority in their father's voice, combined with the terrifying speed of the rising water, broke through their paralysis. Their initial reluctance gave way to a primal, desperate instinct to survive. What followed was a frantic, chaotic ballet of shared purpose. Michael, his expensive suit now soaked and mud-splattered, used his strategic mind to direct the placement of the heavy logs, creating a crude but effective barrier. David, his youthful strength finally finding a purpose, heaved and shoved the logs into place, his face set with a grim determination Samuel had never seen in him before. Sarah, her perfectly manicured hands raw and dirty, worked with a frantic energy, filling sack after sack with heavy, wet earth, her earlier tears replaced by the rain streaming down her face. Samuel was everywhere, his old body moving with a surprising agility, shoring up their makeshift dam, digging a shallow trench with a shovel to redirect the worst of the flow. They were all drenched, shivering, and covered in mud, but they were working as one. The barriers of wealth, resentment, and bitterness were washed away by the leveling force of the storm. They were no longer a businessman, a socialite, and a drifter. They were simply two sons and a daughter fighting alongside their father to save the ground beneath their feet. The storm raged through the night. They retreated into the small cabin, a fortress of fragile warmth against the roaring chaos outside. They huddled together, too exhausted and too emotionally raw to speak. They listened to the terrifying sounds of the flood, the crash of falling trees, and the relentless drumming of rain on the tin roof. The proximity forced upon them by the storm was both a comfort and a torture, a reminder of all the years they had spent apart. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was battered but washed clean. A thick mist rose from the sodden ground, and the only sound was the steady drip of water from the eaves. Inside the cabin, they were a collection of exhausted bodies in muddy clothes, surrounded by the debris of their emotional and literal storm. In the heavy gray silence of the morning after, Samuel rose. His movements were slow, every muscle aching. Without a word, he went to the small kitchen counter. He pulled out the old cast-iron skillet, a bag of flour, and the tin of baking powder. He found the buttermilk and the vanilla, and from memory, he began to mix the batter. Mary's recipe, the one she made every Sunday morning when the children were small. The quiet domestic sounds filled the tense silence, the whisk against the side of the bowl, the clank of the skillet on the stove, and then the soft, welcoming sizzle as the first ladle of batter hit the hot, greased pan. A moment later, the aroma began to fill the small cabin. Sweet, warm, and buttery, the scent of vanilla and buttermilk was more than just the smell of food. It was the smell of childhood. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of a time when their family was whole, a time before the silences grew too long and the distances too great. David, who was slumped in a chair, was the first to react. He lifted his head, his eyes widening slightly as the scent reached him. He looked at his father, then at the skillet. He stood up, and without a word, he walked to the cupboard and began taking down the mismatched plates. Sarah, watching him, hesitated for only a second. Her face was pale and blotchy from crying, but a new, softer light was in her eyes. She went to a drawer and retrieved the forks, then found the old tin of maple syrup, wiping the dust from its lid with the sleeve of her ruined shirt. Michael sat frozen at the table, watching it all. He watched his father's practiced hands flip a pancake. He watched his younger brother and sister move around the small space in a quiet, synchronized dance of domesticity they had not performed in over 20 years. His hard, cynical expression, the armor he had worn for his entire adult life, began to crumble. He lowered his head, and a single tear, hot and unexpected, traced a clean path through the grime on his cheek. Samuel brought the first stack of pancakes to the table. They sat down, the four of them, around the rough wooden table. Ghost, who had been a silent observer through it all, came and lay down under the table, his body a warm, reassuring presence against their legs. No one spoke. There were no apologies, no grand declarations. There was only the quiet scrape of forks against plates and the shared warmth of the simple meal. They ate, and in the shared silence, in the taste of a memory, something sacred was being rebuilt. It was the first family breakfast they had had in a very, very long time. The change, when it came, did not arrive like a thunderclap, but like the slow, quiet dawn after a long storm. In the days that followed, an awkward truce settled over the small cabin. The roads were cleared by a town crew, and the time came for the children to leave. The goodbyes were stilted, full of the things they could not yet say. Sarah was the first to depart. She gave her father a brief, uncharacteristically clumsy hug. "Take care of yourself, Dad," she murmured, her eyes not quite meeting his. Michael followed, offering only a stiff nod. "I will be in touch," he said, the words neutral, a businesslike promise that held a dozen different meanings. David was the last. His bags were packed and in his car, the engine running. He stood on the porch, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. Samuel waited, giving his youngest son the space he had so often denied him in the past. "I think," David began, his voice quiet but clear, "I think I will stay, for a while, to help you finish the repairs." He finally looked up, and in his eyes, Samuel saw not the frightened boy who followed his siblings, but a man making his first true decision. Samuel simply nodded, a deep and profound emotion lodging itself in his throat. "There is work to be done," was all he managed to say. It was enough. And so, the work began anew. But this time it was not a solitary endeavor. David became his father's apprentice. He was clumsy at first, his hands unaccustomed to the rough feel of wood and metal. But he was a willing student. They worked side by side, two quiet men learning a new language together, a language of shared tasks and comfortable silences. Samuel taught David how to read the grain of a piece of oak, how to listen for the subtle hiss of the still, how to tell by smell when the spirit was ready. And in teaching his son the craft of his grandfather, Samuel was, for the first time, teaching him the meaning of heritage. David, in turn, found a quiet confidence in the tangible results of his labor, a sense of self-worth that had eluded him his entire life. He was not just helping his father, he was becoming the son he had never had the chance to be. A few weeks later, a package arrived from the city. It was from Sarah. Inside was not a check or a gift, but a thick, professionally designed portfolio. Samuel sat at the kitchen table and slowly turned the pages. It was a complete branding proposal for Ghost's Reserve. But it was not the slick, commercialized vision she had first pitched. This was different. It focused on authenticity, on heritage, on the story of the mountain and the generations of family that had called it home. She had included mock-ups of labels that were subtle and elegant, and a written narrative that was both respectful and deeply moving. Tucked inside was a handwritten note. "This is Mom's story too," it read. "It should be told the right way. And Dad, I am sorry." The apology, when it came, was just like her, beautifully presented, thoughtful, and from the heart. Samuel folded the note and placed it on the table beside him, a quiet testament to a daughter finding her own way to contribute. Michael's silence lasted the longest. For nearly 2 months, there was no word. Samuel had almost resigned himself to the fact that his eldest son was a loss, a man too encased in his armor of success to ever find his way back. Then one afternoon, the black sedan appeared on the road again. Samuel's heart tensed as Michael stepped out of the car. He was alone, and his usual confident stride was replaced by a more subdued, thoughtful pace. He carried not a business plan, but a single, thick legal document. They sat on the porch, the same place where their last 2 confrontations had occurred. "I am not here to talk about percentages or expansion," Michael said, his voice level. He slid the document across the small table between them. "This is a proposal to establish the Peterson Family Trust. It puts the farm, the brand, everything into a protected legal entity. It cannot be sold. It cannot be broken up. It can only be passed down. It protects the legacy from outsiders, from creditors, from us." He paused. "A legacy needs a fortress. This is how I build." It was the most honest apology Michael was capable of making. He was using his skills, his language of contracts and corporations, not to conquer, but to protect. He had looked at the small, precious thing his father had built, and instead of seeing an asset to be stripped, he had finally seen a home to be defended. The seasons turned. Autumn's fiery colors gave way to the quiet, stark beauty of winter, which in turn yielded to the vibrant green promise of spring. David had stayed, his presence a quiet, steady rhythm in the life of the farm. The first legally distilled batch of the new Ghost's Reserve was aging peacefully in the cellar. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting a warm, golden light across the valley, Samuel sat in his rocking chair on the porch. The letter from Sarah lay on the table beside him, its pages filled with news of a small article about their brand that had appeared in a prestigious magazine. From the barn he could hear the gentle, rhythmic sound of David sanding a new barrel. At his feet, Ghost lay sleeping in a patch of sun. The old dog was grayer now, a little stiffer in the mornings, but his life was one of deep, contented peace. He was surrounded by his pack, his world whole and secure. Samuel looked out at the mountains, at the wisps of cloud catching the last of the sun's fire. A profound sense of peace, deeper and more complete than any he had ever known, settled over him. The anger, the grief, the years of Danvat, they were not gone, but they had settled, like silt at the bottom of a clear, calm river. The house was no longer just a shelter, and the farm was no longer just a place of exile. He had not just restored a distillery. He had laid the first bricks, the heavy, hard-won foundation stones of a home, a place where his lost children, at long last, could find their way back. Perhaps the greatest lesson from Samuel and Ghost is that a true home is not a place we own, but something we build from the broken pieces of forgiveness and loyalty. Their journey teaches us that it is never too late to mend what is broken, and that the quiet, unwavering love of an animal can often show us the way back to ourselves. If you believe in stories of second chances, we would be honored if you would join our community by subscribing. Your thoughts in the comments mean the world to us, and sharing this tale helps their legacy reach others. As their new life begins on the mountain, another story is just beginning for you, right now on the screen.